On behalf of the Center for International Studies here at MIT, welcome. I'm John Tierman of the Center, and we're particularly delighted that this event is co-sponsored by the Program on Environmental Governance and Sustainability, which is a new program at the Center. I'll get back to that in a moment. But before we start, I want to alert you to two upcoming events, and you can check our website for exact time and place. One is going to be on Afghanistan with Admiral Fallon, a visiting fellow at the Center this year, and then a very interesting discussion on Iran in early May, I think May 5th, and we invite you to come to those. We'll have, after Bill McKibben speaks, we'll have some time for Q&A, and we invite you to come up to the microphones, and we'll go back and forth to give you a chance to ask a question in a little while. Introducing Bill today is the director of this new program on environmental governance and sustainability, professor at MIT in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning, Joanne Carmen.
Thank you all for coming and helping us to officially announce that this center is taking root at CIS. I look forward to seeing all of you there. But I know you came not to hear about CIS, but to hear from our guests, who I have the great fortune to introduce. For the past 20 years, Bill has been helping all of us learn how to protect and preserve the environment. And when I was thinking about what to say this morning, I sat there and actually just stared at my bookshelf, and I thought, I've grown up with you. I've been growing old with you, Bill. And what you've done for all of us is you've taken issues that for many of us, maybe we knew they were out there, maybe not. Maybe the global community knew it was out there, maybe not. And what you've done is you've taken them out from the corners and you brought them right under the spotlight. And you've helped us realize what's important. And as a scholar, as a writer, as an educator, you've taught us about these issues. You've told us what it is that we need to know. You've told us what the consequences of inaction might be. And then you've gone the extra mile. You've turned and you said, it's not enough to know about this. You have to take action. And so the activist in you has taught all of us that we can actually make a difference. So here we are, about a week before Earth Day. And I think this is a great moment for each and every one of us to take a moment and reflect what it is that we can do to make a difference in the world. And of course, who better to inform us and to teach us and to inspire us than Bill. So thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for that extremely kind introduction. You know, it's true that once upon a time, I was a good writer and thinker and so on and so forth. And I'm afraid that time is, at least for the moment, past. And now I'm just a sleep-deprived activist and organizer. And so I'm going to inflict some of that on you all today. I'll try to just sum it up, an idea or two along the way. But mostly, I'm afraid I want to try to put you to work in this fight, which is coming down to the wire. And some of you were here earlier today in this room when Ed Markey and John Holdren were on hand. And, you know, no kidding, we're at crunch time now. I'm going to talk for a few minutes about the history of climate and our understanding of it, because it sets up the rest of what I want to say. I apologize in advance for doing that, because I know that you already know this stuff, but it's worth remembering just how fresh, in a way, much of this understanding is, what a new problem it is we're grappling with, because the newness of it is one of the things it hasn't had time to mature in the way that problems normally do in our political world. Okay? 20 years ago, this year, when I wrote The End of Nature, it was the first book about global warming that there had been. All right? And at the time, it was still a hypothesis, right? Human beings are pouring enough carbon into the atmosphere to materially alter the climate. It seems scientifically sound. There are a lot of good minds, including good minds here at MIT, that knew enough about the molecular structure of carbon dioxide to understand that this was a problem. On the other hand, it was very emotionally counterintuitive. The idea that human beings had grown large enough to alter everything that was going on around them in the world seemed unlikely, frankly. And so science set to work with more resources, more money, more human hours, more computing power than had ever been applied to any problem before in the period roughly 1989 to 1995. And partly this was because governments didn't want to do anything about climate, but there was a lot of demand for something, so they'd spend money on it. And there was research money to be had, and it was well spent. People put up, weather balloons and satellites. They cored glaciers. They did everything. Mostly refined the vast computer models that are our best understanding of what the world looks like in the future. By 1995, the world's climatologists were ready to more or less agree on a rough and ready consensus. Human beings are heating up the planet. It's going to be a serious problem. Almost a kind of coming-of-age moment for us as a species. We'd suddenly realized just how big we'd gotten in very short order. Since 1995, the planet has been conducting a thorough peer review of this research to make sure it was correct. We've had all 10 of the warmest years on record since then. And what had been hypothesis and became not just consensus, but very entrenched and deeply rooted consensus, that this was the biggest problem we'd ever faced. In the last 18 months, that consensus has turned into a kind of panic, at least on the sort of cutting edge of people looking at this science. And the reason is that change is happening on a larger scale and at a quicker pace than we had anticipated even a few years ago. And since you guys are scientifically literate, it makes it easier for me to just explain this with a few quick numbers. And I'll lead up to the most important number in the world. Before the Industrial Revolution, the atmospheric concentration of CO2 is 275 parts per million, plus or minus 10 parts per million throughout human civilization. This is depending on your particular view of the world, this is the Eden number or the Shakespeare number or the Buddha number, or however you want to sort of view the world, That's where our civilization came from. The incredibly stable Holocene that was produced by that level of carbon in the atmosphere. Industrial Revolution comes, and we take tens of millions of years worth of biology, and in the course of 200 years, put it into the atmosphere, And no surprise, stuff starts to happen. The amount of carbon in the atmosphere begins to mount and mount rapidly. We never knew where the red line was, where the danger line was, The number we used 20 years ago a lot, and this is a sort of cautionary thing about how humans model the world in their minds. The number we used a lot 20 years ago was 550 parts per million. Not because we really had any sense that that was going to be the danger point. It's because it was double the pre-industrial revolution concentration and hence relatively easy to model on a computer. So everybody plugged in 550 parts per million and churned out a lot of papers saying, here are terrible things that would happen at 5, and that's the number that just stuck. And I can show you lots of charts from the early 1990s where there's a sharp red line drawn at 550. We began to suspect that that was too high. The number that people began to toss around 7, 8 years ago was 450 parts per million. Again, not really based on very much. In the summer of 2007, Arctic sea ice melted at an alarming pace. Arctic sea ice has been melting for 40 years, a little bit less each year on average, about 1% less. But in the summer of 2007, the ice just fell off a cliff. We were losing an area of ice the size of California every week for 6 weeks at the end of that melt season. And by the time it was done, There was 25% less ice than there'd ever been before. Okay, this is one of the, 3 or 4 big physical features on the planet, all right? That white cap at the top of the Arctic. And all of a sudden, it's hardly there anymore, you know? I mean, those pictures of the world from Apollo 8 look startlingly different now. There's a lot less white, sort of the reverse of what's happened with my picture over the last 40 years. You know, there's less white on top in those. That scared people, scientists studying this stuff, because it wasn't supposed to happen that fast. We never knew quite where the threshold for this was, but people assumed it was still some years in the future. We'd talked about 2050. 2060, 2070 as years when we might see a full disappearance of summer sea ice in the Arctic. And all of a sudden, after 2007, people were saying 2013, 2014, you know. And of course, when that happens, it's not only confirmation that the planet is warming fast, there's no other reason why you would suddenly lose all that ice. But of course, it's its own feedback effect. You remove that nice white mirror and replace it with a blue sponge that absorbs 80% of incoming solar radiation. That signal starts to do all kinds of other things. The scientists talk about Arctic amplification. You can now find that highly elevated temperature about 1,500 kilometers inland from the Arctic Ocean. And one of the big results of that has been the rapid melt of permafrost, and hence the escape from beneath it of the CH4, the methane that's underneath that permafrost, which is a potent greenhouse gas in its own right. And the volume of that in the atmosphere has spiked in the last couple of years, and that's the apparent source. Scientists have reported finding ponds and marshes and wetlands wide open, unfrozen at 40 below zero in the middle of the Siberian winter because there's so much CO2 bubbling up from beneath that it keeps it open, all right? Those are scary, those kind of feedback loops, if you think about them for a minute, because they raise the very real possibility that unless we get things under control very fast, we won't be able to get them under control. That is, we're only indirectly releasing that methane. We put enough carbon in the atmosphere to raise the temperature, to melt the permafrost, and the methane comes up from beneath, right? Even if we do everything right, in terms of getting off coal and gas and oil very, very fast and not putting more carbon into the atmosphere, at a certain point, we're not able to slow down those other processes or stop them anyway. It takes on a life of its own. So that's the reason that people were beginning to panic. And in January of 2008, our foremost climatologist, Jim Hansen at NASA, one of the real great scientific heroes of the last 20 years, he and his team at NASA put out a paper with this most important number. They said that the most carbon you can have in the atmosphere and still have a planet, as they put it, similar to that on which civilization developed and to which life on Earth is adapted, okay? The most is 350 parts per million, and probably less than that. Right? That's a very tough number, okay? It's a very tough number, A, because we're already past it. We're at 387 parts per million and rising about 2 parts per million per year, which is why the Arctic is melting, you know? It's why we're seeing, you know, huge die-off of forests across the boreal north. It's why we're seeing 1,000 other phenomena that we could talk about. It's not, the analogy I've been using is, it's not like when someone goes to the doctor and the doctor says, sir, you know, continue your habit of eating cheese at each meal and someday your cholesterol will be too high, okay? This is like going to the doctor and the doctor said, well, you know, you probably shouldn't have eaten cheese at every meal because now your cholesterol really is way too high and you're in that zone where you're very likely to have a stroke or a heart attack and you better hope you get it down before that happens, all right? We're in that zone and we're having the strokes. That's what all that sea ice disappearing from the Arctic is. And there are plenty of other strokes like that, thresholds that we don't think anymore are as far off as we used to. Very rapid rise in sea level, perhaps big shifts in monsoonal rain patterns, on and on and on. It's also a tough number because to ever get back to it, we would have to basically end fossil fuel combustion on this planet in the next 20 years or so. Especially coal. What their data showed was that if we're still in the process of burning coal at 2030 on this Earth, we will not be able to ever get back to that number. The Earth, of course, scrubs some carbon out of the atmosphere each year, forests and oceans, although those sinks are being dramatically degraded by just by the simple fact of the new heat. But to have any hope of those working to get this carbon out of there, we have to stop putting more in. And we have to start doing it quickly. That's what their data and now a number of other people's data seems to indicate. All right. One way of saying this is that it's a conceptually different problem than we thought of even 18 months ago. The way to think about climate change is not a future threat that's going to bother you or in your old age or your children or your grandchildren. Okay? Not a problem for your grandparents to solve, grandchildren to solve. Really, it's a problem for your parents to have solved, you know. We're past the point where we should be, and now we have to do it very, very quickly. And even if we do, we're not going to stop global warming, obviously. We've already seen significant warming, and we'll see more. We've warmed the Earth about 1 degree Fahrenheit, and there's another degree or degree and a half in the pipeline already. And the effects that we're seeing now are profound enough to be very frightening. Obviously, you alter hydrological cycles immensely because warm air holds more water vapor than cold, okay? So we've seen dramatic increases in drought around the world, maybe most powerfully in Australia over the last few years. What seems to be happening is that the meteorological tropics, the area that the scientists would define as the tropics on their meteorological characteristics, have expanded about 2 degrees north and south over the last 10 years. And in turn, that's pushed the dry subtropics further north and further south. And much of Australia is now moving into that zone of great dryness. They've had epic drought there, and of course you've seen the pictures of the wildfires that have resulted. A couple of weeks ago, the Australian Meteorological Office said, we're no longer going to use that term drought to define what's going on here, because drought implies that it will come to an end at some point. We think this is the new normal that we have here, and we're going to have to figure out, if we can, how to deal with it, okay? Other parts of Australia, because what goes up comes down, you know, that are in wet places, seeing enormous increases in deluge, in flooding. And of course, we're seeing that in wet places around the world, including at this latitude, where storms that drop more than 2 inches of rain in a 24-hour period are up about 25 or 30% over the baseline. And these are the destructive kind of storms that do nobody any good and do a lot of people a lot of damage, all right? I could spend the entire day just standing here listing problems for you. I'm not going to do it, but I will tell you one story, just because it describes, from my own personal life, the hinge moment for when I decided I needed to do more about this than just write and talk about it, okay? Some years ago, not that many years ago, I was in Bangladesh, which is one of the great countries in the world, incredibly beautiful, incredibly fertile, delta, where the sacred rivers of Asia, the Ganges and the Brahmaputra, come down out of the Himalayas. And because it's a river delta, it floods gently each August and leaves behind a little layer of silt, and hence its fertility is just beyond belief. You know, trees that would be 100 years old here are 2 or 3 years old there. Things just explode out of the ground, okay? It's a country of 140 million people living in an area the size of Wisconsin, all right? But they feed themselves. They're food self-sufficient. But they're completely screwed. They're the sort of perfect example of 1,000 other places that we could talk about. For one thing, those rivers that feed it have their source in the great glaciers of the Himalayas. Okay? And those glaciers are melting very fast, and there's now plenty of reason to think that they will be gone in 30 or 40 years. One of the beautiful features of the Holocene, okay, was that it was warm enough that we didn't have ice sheets across the continental interiors, but cold enough that we had this beautiful cold storage for water in the Himalayas and the Andes and the snowpack of the Sierra, on and on, that allowed, easy habitat. I've been in the part of Tibet, an area about the size of Italy, where glaciers provide the headwaters for the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, the Yellow, the Yangtze, the Mekong, the Salween. Okay, 1 human being in 3 lives downstream from these places, and that's why they live where they live, okay, because the water's there. And there's no plan B for what happens once it dries up. The same thing is going on in the Andes, and the same thing is going on in the American West. Stephen Chu, the new Secretary of Energy, said in California about a month ago, he was talking to a group of businessmen and said, I don't think you quite get the scale of what we're talking about here, okay? He said, if that snowpack disappears, and our model shows that it well may before the century is over, there's going to be no more agriculture in California, and you may not be able to live in the big cities either, okay? That's fairly frank talk from your cabinet officials, and that's the same story. Okay, so that's one problem for Bangladesh. Another problem is that the Bay of Bengal is quickly rising, like sea level everywhere. And if you raise it a few inches, that pushes salt water well up into the rivers, contaminates fields, wells, everything else. We used to think we'd see about 2 feet of sea level rise this century, due mostly to thermal expansion. Warm water takes up more space than cold. We now think, because Greenland and the West Antarctic look far less stable than we'd presumed even a few years ago, that we're talking 5 or 6 or 7 feet of sea level rise this century, which, if we allow it to happen, are civilization-challenging numbers. Okay? There's not enough money on Earth to cope with the kind of change in infrastructure you'd need to protect our, fixed investment in, since most people live near the coast, most of all of our great cities would become New Orleans in that scenario, and New Orleans would become Atlantis. I mean, I was just in New Orleans last week, and people there are quite clear that there's no way they can survive under that kind of scenario. But when I was in Bangladesh, it wasn't these chronic problems that had people's attention. It was a very acute problem. They're having their first big outbreak of dengue fever. All right? Dengue is a mosquito-borne disease that the World Health Organization says will be the emergent disease of this century, because the mosquito that spreads it, Aedes aegypti, loves the warmer, wetter world that we're creating. Very sensitive to changes in humidity and temperature. Range is expanding rapidly. We've seen increases in incidence of 200, 300, 400% across South America and Asia this decade. Brazil, last fall, the Army had to open field hospitals across the interior of the country because emergency rooms were getting 400 cases an hour of people presenting with dengue. Okay? When I was in Dhaka in Bangladesh, they were having their first big outbreak of this disease ever. And since I was spending a lot of time in the slums, I got bit by the wrong mosquito and I came down with it. Okay, obviously I survived. I was healthy and strong going in, all of that. Lots of people didn't survive. Lots of people died, old people, young people, poor people, whatever. I remember going down to the emergency room, not the emergency room, like the hospital in Dhaka, the one big ward, very large room, and cots. You can see cots for a long ways. People lying on the cots shivering, and in between, people lying on the floor shivering because there's not enough cots, okay? And I was shivering, but I remember standing there thinking, okay, the main thought I kept thinking was, these people have done nothing to cause this. This is, they're taking it in the chin, but when you measure the amount of carbon that Bangladesh emits, you can't even really get a number for it. The UN and the UN tables, it's a kind of rounding error, okay? People use the bicycle rickshaw to get around. Most people aren't on the electric grid. They just not burn. The 4% of us in the United States produce 25% of the world's CO2. The moral mathematics, though not the precise epidemiology, I suppose, seems to me that 1 out of 4 beds in that hospital is our responsibility. Okay? At any rate, that was the kind of realization that brought me back to the United States, determined to actually try to do something a little more than I had done, because this was 3 or 4 years ago. We'd done nothing, literally nothing. Our federal government in then 15 or so years of dealing with climate change, had not passed a single law to materially affect it. We had just stared at the biggest problem that humans had ever created and engaged in a deep, very successful bipartisan effort to ignore it, and it was time to change that. I didn't know how to. I mean, there were some good things going on. Al Gore's movie was out there, right? And so people were getting woken up to this and paying some attention. But there wasn't the kind of activism that seemed to me that we needed. On the other hand, I'm a writer, and I live out in the woods in Vermont. Writers aren't, by their at least me, not very, sort of socially ill at ease and whatever. Not good at organizing. Sort of, we're good at sitting in our room and typing. Okay, it's a different thing. So I called up some of my writer friends. Said, look, we're going to go to. Here's the plan. We're going to go up to Burlington, which is our main city in Vermont. And we will, not a very main city, it's only about 50,000 people, but it's as good as we've got, okay? And we said we're going to sit in on the steps of the federal building, and we'll get arrested, and there'll be a little story in the paper, and we will have done something. All these guys were just as clueless about all this as, so that's a good plan. Let's do that, But some one of them calls up to the police in Burlington, says, what'll happen if we carry out this intrepid stunt, and the police say nothing will happen, stay there as long as you want, we'll come visit. So it's like, oh, okay. So we had to recalibrate. We just started sending out letters and telling people, come join us, we're going to go for a walk, emailing everybody we knew. So about 3 weeks later, this was Labor Day 2006, we set out on this walk, okay, and we walked for 5 days, and we slept in farm fields at night. There are people here who are along for this great, fun walk. And, I'm a Methodist Sunday school teacher, so we had, called ahead to the Methodist Mafia, and we did, programs in Sunday churches and stuff in the evening and things. And we finally get to Burlington, and there's 1,000 people marching, okay? So here's what you have to understand. In Vermont, 1,000 people is an unbelievably large number of people, okay? I mean, maybe at University of Vermont hockey games you might see 1,000 people, but that is it. Cows were running in terror from the fence line as we went by, okay? So it's way more than enough people to get all of our representatives, all people running for Congress or Senate in 2006, to come meet with us down on the shore of Lake Champlain, okay? And not just to meet with us. They all sign on to this raggedy piece of cardboard that we've been carrying across the countryside that says that they'll work to cut carbon emissions 80% by 2050. All right? Well, at the time, this was a very radical proposition. All right? No politicians were in favor of it, only scientists. Okay? But it was way beyond anybody in Washington was willing to even talk about. Much too radical. But everybody signed, and not just the liberal Democrats. We have plenty of those in Vermont, but the conservative Republicans too. The woman who was running for Congress on the GOP ticket and who almost won, the adjutant general of our state National Guard, she had said 2 months before when she launched her campaign, she said what people always say, and these, too many politicians say, I'm not sure global warming is real. More research needs to be done. Turned out that the more research that needed to be done was on the question, how many people will walk across Vermont and ask me to change my mind, okay? And it turns out 1,000's enough, empirically, because she signs this thing, all right? So we're like, this was good. We'd become too cynical, me and the mostly young people that I was working with, okay? This was all pre-Barack, so we were still cynical about politics, okay? And it was good for us to see it all work the way it's supposed to work, all right? We were like, whoa, that's good. But then we opened the paper the next morning, and there's a story in this paper that says, these 1,000 people, this might be the largest demonstration that's yet taken place in the country about climate change. We're like, whoa, no wonder that we're not doing so well, in this campaign. We have, the parts of the, of a movement. We've got leaders. We've got Al Gore. We've got economists, we've got scientists, obviously we've got policy people. The only part of the movement that we've neglected is the movement part. There's no people there to give it some heft. So we decided to see what we could do to do something about that. And this is the part, especially for the students here, that I just want you to listen to for a minute, because the sub-theme of it is, if someone as clueless as I and the people I was working with could do this, then anybody can do it. There's some real experienced and useful organizers in this room today who've done this. We weren't that. There were 7 of us, me and 6 students at Middlebury College. They were seniors. So they weren't done with school, but they actually were pretty much done with school and ready to work on this. And in January of 2007, we opened this website, stepitup07.org. And we don't have any money. We don't have any organization. We just, again, start sending out emails, okay? And our secret hope is that we will organize 100 of these rallies across the country on April 14th, which would have been 100 more than there'd been, and we would have been happy. We didn't tell anyone because we didn't want to be humiliated, but that was the hope. Instead, thanks to people like people in this room all over the country, and there are people in this room who responded to this call immediately and helped us, the thing just went viral, all right? And 3 months later, on April 14th, there were 1,400 of these demonstrations in all 50 states. It was the biggest day of grassroots environmental activism since the first Earth Day in 1970. 2 points I want to make about it. One was its odd, decentralized nature. When we'd started, people said, you should do a march on Washington. That's how this is done. And they were many times sort of veterans of a earlier movement. Well, A, we didn't have the resources to do a march on Washington. B, we thought there seemed something slightly off about telling people to drive across America to protest global warming, Mostly, we knew people would know how to do this in their place in a way that would make sense to their neighbors. And I'll show you just a few pictures from that day, because what we did was have people have things where they were and then instantly upload images, right, back to this website. And we'd rented out a big hall in D.C., and we got in all the politicians we could find. And it was almost like election night. We're just watching the returns come in. And they're coming in at a certain point, 10 or 20 a minute from around the country. And each picture just more beautiful than the next. That's a little part of a big rally in L.A. in Griffiths Park, okay? That's a lot of kids in front of the Capitol. That's some of my students at Middlebury with flashlights. Thousands of people in lower Manhattan in blue shirts, everybody holding hands. Sea of people, we called it. A human, New Yorkers look at the world through real estate, right? So we wish to show them which real estate would be underwater. This sort of human tide line did the trick. Key West, Florida, only coral reefs in the continental U.S. Coral reefs are an ecosystem that the researchers tell us will not be there in 50 years if temperature continues to warm. We're already seeing massive bleaching and well, they didn't do a terrestrial demonstration. They got lots of people in scuba gear. They went underwater. The video is great. There's fish swimming in and around, big kind of interspecies political work. Just everywhere. That's my daughter's junior high school, so when I get homesick, I like to show that. That's lots and lots of people on the levees in New Orleans. That's a carbon footprint. That's the marching band at Penn State or someplace. Lots of people up on glaciated peaks in the west that aren't going to be glaciated much longer. In fact, the Park Service said last week that they think now Glacier National Park will need a new name in 2020 because the last glacier will have melted. That's 800 school kids in Park City, Utah, sitting in the snow. And up at the top, that odd writing, it says in Inuit, it says, "We hear you." These kids have been pen pals with lots of kids up in the far north whose lives are, whose landscape is literally disappearing beneath their feet, and responding to that. Lots of polar bears in bikinis everywhere, just on and on and on. It was a really cool day. So that was one of the good things about it. The other good thing about it was that it was effective. 3 days later, both Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama dramatically changed their energy and environment platforms and adopt this 80% cut as the centerpiece of their platforms. And if you listen today to Ed Markey, this new legislation in Congress now enshrines that as the ultimate goal or whatever. So we were feeling quite good about ourselves. The technical term would be smug, okay, in the wake of this, all right? And then 6 weeks later, the Arctic starts to melt. And we begin to understand, A, that things are happening very fast, and in fact, even 80% by 2050 isn't fast enough. We need big cuts much more quickly than we'd understood before. And B, we were reminded again of what we should have known in a way all along, the global nature of this problem, and the fact that it will only be solved globally if it's going to be solved. And this is the year for that to happen. In December of this year, the world's leaders come together in Copenhagen, in Denmark, to agree on, hopefully, a new treaty that will be the replacement for the Kyoto Accords. All right? We used to think this would be a kind of evolutionary document that would just toughen the, cuts a little bit and include some more countries, and we'd kick the problem on, 10 years into the future and meet again, and so on and so forth. We now understand, given the science, that this is the last really plausible bite at the apple we're going to have, the last chance to come up with a kind of architecture for the world's carbon system that sets things in motion fast enough to potentially make a real dent. So it becomes an incredibly important day. And unfortunately, if those negotiations were held today, the result they would produce would be way below what we need. Okay, all the drafts and documents and things, most of which have been kicking around for many years, don't reflect the new scientific understanding of where we are. So, coming on a year and a half ago now, right after Jim Hansen and his team delivered that paper, we decided to form a new campaign. And we've called it 350.org, all right? And it takes, fairly unusually, a scientific idea, scientific bottom line, and tries to translate it into real political action. It's not the first thing that one would choose, okay? It's an arcane number. It's hard to get people around the world sort of thinking about parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere, all right? It's something you think about in chemistry class or earth science or something, and maybe, and then never again, unless you become an atmospheric chemist or whatever. But we realized early on that there were a couple of good things about it. Okay? One, it really does set a tangible target. The worst outcome in Copenhagen, will be that they're definitely going to produce an agreement, right? You're not going to get 180 world leaders in the hall and then just have them, forget it, we screwed up, couldn't do anything. They'll produce an agreement. The problem will be if it's an agreement that doesn't do anything close to what we need and just kind of locks us in for many years into, that's a real disaster. So we needed some kind of campaign that would do more than just say, do something about global warming. We needed to tell them what to do about global warming, and we needed to say, here's the ruler by which we will measure whether what you're doing makes sense or not. That's one good thing about it. The other good thing about it, it turns out, is that if you're going to try to organize the world, which is a ludicrous proposition to begin with, all right, that a number is a good thing to work with, because Arabic numerals are one of the very few things that translate easily around the world. All right? You kind of run into big problems the minute that you start using words. I was explaining this to someone the other day, and the analogy I was using, one of the very few organizations in the world that's tried to organize on a global basis is the Coca-Cola Company. Okay? And they've been quite successful, albeit at the cost of billions of dollars and decades worth of effort. But you've noticed that they've reduced by now their slogan to, the current slogan of Coke is it, all right? A slogan that has no meaning whatsoever. And that's because at a certain level, when you're trying to talk to everyone, Coke's slogan before this, some of you are old enough to remember, was Coke adds life. Okay? Turned out that translated into billboards around the world, it became Coke brings your ancestors back from the dead. Okay? Which turned out not to be a big selling point. Okay? So 350 has some use, has some value in that way. At least it means the same thing everywhere. We spent the last year building networks and getting in the kind of elite climate community this message out. And we've been successful. In December, Al Gore stood up in Poznan in Poland, the last big climate meeting before Copenhagen. And he gave the final wrap-up of the speech. And we'd talked with him a lot. He's very, up-to-date on things. And we'd been talking with him. And he said about three-quarters of the way through his speech, which was a good speech, he said, almost as an aside, he said, and by the way, the target that we need is no longer 450 parts per million, it's 350 parts per million. Well, this hall erupts, okay? People are just by far the biggest applause of the whole week for anything anybody had said, which startled him some. It showed that this message had gotten around and that the people in that community are understanding that we need much quicker progress than we believed before. Okay, that was important. This year is the more interesting year. This year, and here's where we need your help, the task is to take this number and put it into as many human heads and hearts as we can over the course of the next now 7 months or so. On October 24th, we're having a big global day of action, the global equivalent of what we did in the spring of 2007. And there will be actions of one kind or another all over the world. We officially sent out the first email about this 5 or 6 days ago, and there are now more than 400 actions registered in more than 50 countries, okay? So we're off to a good start, and people have come up with incredibly powerful things to do. There will be climbers high up in the Himalayas with banners and stomping things in the snow. There'll be 350 scuba divers on the Great Barrier Reef. There'll be Easter Island is the great poster child, yes, for what happens if you don't think about your environment. There's going to be a team of people on Easter Island, normally uninhabited, but not that day, draping banners from the noses of those large stone guys, that are there. There are going to be stuff going on everywhere. And I got to tell you, it is incredibly moving to open the email and find what people are thinking of and how they're. Opened the email a couple of months ago. And there was some farmer in the Cameroon in West Africa who'd heard about this through a cell phone. People aren't plugged into the net exactly, but in the developing world, you have to get very far back of beyond before you get places where there aren't mobile phones now. And people have learned to use them the way that we use the computer, transmit a lot of information. Well, somehow he'd seen about this and understood it, and he and his neighbors had planted 350 trees on the edge of their village and hung sign, looked just like that one that somebody hung here this morning, and took a picture of it with the cell phone and sent it to us. Well, that was good because we got it on the cover of the whatever the Cameroon equivalent of the New York Times is, there it was the next day. We knew how to do that. But what it really was moving, It almost made me cry because that people in the Cameroon they're not causing global warming, okay? This farmer living in the Cameroon had done essentially nothing in his life to contribute to this problem, but they'd figured out that it was possible to be part of the solution to it in some way. That we had this new tool, the internet, that allows us to begin to actually perhaps work as a world on a problem. In fact, I would go far enough to say that though the people at MIT and elsewhere who built the internet piece by piece over the last couple of decades. Didn't realize it at the time exactly. This was the reason that it was being built, not so that you could play poker all night in your underwear, so that you could take a simple piece of information, an incredibly important piece of information, and share it all around the world, and figure out how to use it to mobilize action, and then have action in real life, and then take images of that action and upload it and share it with the world and make it larger. I mean, we had a way bigger march than we could have fit on the mall in Washington in the spring of 2007, It just happened in a lot of places. And we're going to have an enormous concatenation of people from around the planet on October 24th that we really want you to be a part of. People are figuring out in their own communities how to do that, how to make it clear, okay? So we have people here today from, say, religious communities across this part of the world who have plenty of churches. Fred, your church, yes, rang the bells already 350 times one day, and we'll do it again on October 24th, and we're hoping we're going to have thousands of churches doing that. And it turns out to be a good strategy. No TV or radio reporter can resist going and doing a story on it, and they have to explain what it means, and you have to tell your parishioners and make it, all that kind of thing. We have the greatest mountain climbers in the world, and scuba divers, and on and on and on, who are all figuring out cool things to do. One of the reasons I wanted to come to MIT, frankly, was that people at MIT are good at thinking of clever things. Now, I know this because I went to school down the street at the other end of Mass Ave, okay? And I can remember every year when the middle of the football field during the Harvard game would explode in sort of strange, fireworks that come out from nowhere, or, things would... We need some people thinking very cleverly about how to do some weird and funny things, okay? And using the particular sets of skills that you and your friends and colleagues have, all right? I'm very attracted this year to people who have any kind of odd skills. I was just talking the other day to a convention of all the water keepers from all the rivers and lakes and coastlines and stuff around this country. And I was saying to them, well, I'm interested in you because global warming is going to affect lakes and rivers. But what I'm really interested in is that you guys all have boats, and you know other people who have boats. And you'll think of something very cool to do with boats on October 24th. Okay, that's the first thing that we need from you guys. The second thing is we need some very good ideas and some very hard work to push the kind of viralness of this out around the web, all right? This technology is very powerful, but it's still quite nascent. We're still learning a lot about it, learning how, and so we need to be able to figure out how to harness that power of email, of Twitter, of Facebook, or of whatever else, and get that message out. We have this short letter asking people to participate. If the people in this room today went home and went to 350.org and copied it out and then used the email, the address book on your email or whatever else you use on the net to start pushing that out to 50 or 100 people or whatever, not all of them would respond, but even if 10% of them did and then continued it on and 10% of them, we'd quickly build the kind of volume and breadth. That notion that we're all 6 degrees of separation from each other is actually testable now, and to the degree that people can test it, it's turning out to be true. It really is possible to reach all kinds of places. The most unlikely places. Opened the email the other day, and there was from the kingdom of Ladakh, high in the Himalayas, okay, a very remote place, as remote as you get really in this world. Somehow they'd heard about this. Some American high school student had known somebody there and got them. They're mostly Buddhists. There are very few Methodists, I believe, in Ladakh. Mostly Buddhists, and the Buddhist Association they'd spent this day out in the city of Leh, their only real community, which is smaller than Burlington, I believe, and they'd had 1,500 people out. Someone did the math, and it's like the equivalent of 5 million people showing up on the mall in Washington. Okay, they'd been out there all day. They listened to talks. Apparently, a 94-year-old man gave an hour-long disquisition on how the weather had changed in his lifetime, I think most of which consisted of pointing at the glaciers and saying they're melting, because they are, and very fast. And then they posed at the end of the day, 1,500 people, most of them monks and nuns, in a sort of human 350 against this backdrop of the mountains. Incredibly beautiful, and again, very, very moving. It's that kind of cooperation that we have to figure out, strategize on how to make happen around the world, and as quickly as possible. And I'm going to close, since I've been very frank all the way along. In fact, can we pass that stuff around, Roger? And Kate, this is very old-fashioned and low-tech, but just pass around those lists a couple of different directions and give us your email address so we can keep you up to date. You can do this more easily just by going to 350.org yourself, and some of you can probably do it as you're sitting here with your devices. But the truth is that there's absolutely no guarantee that this will work. There's no guarantee that anything will work at this point. You can make a reasonable argument, and there are scientists who do, that we have waited too long to begin, and that the physical momentum of these systems is now great enough that it'll be very difficult, if at all possible, to rein them in. Secondly, we're talking about overcoming a great amount of inertia in all of our economies and indeed in all of our lives. Human beings, Western human beings, are flesh-colored devices for combusting fossil fuel, viewed in one way. And it'll be very difficult to make those changes. And three, it'll be extremely difficult to make them because there's enormous opposition. ExxonMobil made more money last year than any company in the history of money, all right? It made $40 billion. In our political system, that buys you plenty of influence. And believe me, they're using it hard to figure out how to slow down actual action on any of this. So I don't know whether or not this will work in the end, but I think that it's a reasonable shot. I think it's about as good a shot as we've got at this point. And we've got to take it, and here I will end, to the degree that we're going to take that shot, we've got to do it quickly. That's the thing about global warming that makes it different from any social or environmental problem that we've faced in the past, okay? Think about Dr. King and the civil rights movement, okay? They had to be way braver than any of us have to be. No one's going to shoot you for talking about global warming, But they knew they were going to win in the end. What did Martin Luther King say the night before he was shot, In that speech in the sermon in Memphis? I've been to the mountaintop. I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but you will get there. I mean, they knew. He always said at the end of each talk, he'd say, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. He was quoting the Massachusetts abolitionist, Theodore Parker. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. You will get there. The arc of the physical universe is short, and it bends toward heat, and it's bending fast, all right? If we don't get this right quickly, we won't get it right. It's a time test. At a certain point, nature blows a whistle, and you have to put down your pens and close your blue books, and that's it, And nature does not grade on a curve, We either will have done this correctly or we won't have done it. That's the morally urgent question of our moment. It is incredibly deep and tough question, which is why we have to be incredibly creative and determined and joyful at some level in the fight against it in order to have enough energy to do what we need to do as fast as we need to do it. I want to end just by showing you this 90-second video that we put together. People at a wonderful animation outfit called Free Range Studios, friends of ours, put this together. It's been seen tens of millions of times now on cell phone screens and, wherever. And the challenge is How do you tell the story without a relatively difficult scientific story and political strategies story without using any words, okay? Because you have to show it all over the world. This is what we came up with, and I show it to you now as we end, just in the hopes that it'll start getting you thinking about things that you can do and how you can be part of this. And as soon as it's done, we'll have questions and things. So let's see if we can show this. I don't think I need to. Oh, good. Here it goes. There should be some music, some sound with it, if you. But there isn't. I think it's paused now for a minute. Usually goes a little more quickly than this. So that's why I'm guessing. There we go. I shouldn't have said I had been to Harvard. That's clearly the trouble here. Well, you know what? It's yeah, that's right. And you actually, I mean, let's just show it without the sound and not worry about it. It's only another 60 seconds. You have to endure this. Yeah. In fact, we don't even need to see it. Why don't we just do some questions and comments and ideas is the thing I would like most if you had any. But abuse would be okay too. Thank you very much just for coming and sitting and listening to this. October 24th. Good question. There's no great reason for the date other than it's right before Copenhagen and this big international meeting in Copenhagen on climate. And it's about 6 weeks before, and the theory is that it's in the window where people and the press will be paying attention to climate change, but with just enough time to kind of influence still the positions and outcomes and things for that meeting. So it's strategically located around that meeting, and it turns out also to be United Nations Day, although we didn't really know that when we started, which is a very good thing.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Excuse me, for questions, could you line up at the microphones? Thanks.
Yeah, Bill?
Yes.
Hi. Why is this seem to be targeted toward legislators and leaders? It's as if the model for the valves and cogs and wheels that control these things are located in such small places that those are the people, whoever they are, that we have to reach, as opposed to, as the saying goes, taking it in our own hands.
Absolutely.
And having some kind of popular, when you talk about mass movement, it's not just to influence those few other people, right, those 20 other people, but what about mass activity on a large scale where that would make a difference?
Well, we're going to try to go on as large scale as we possibly can, you know. And one of the good things about the design of this kind of campaign is that it allows people wherever they are to talk about the things that are, you know, important in their own community. So, for instance, places where, say, transportation is a big issue and people are thinking about it and there's a movement, okay? There are going to be lots of places where there'll be bike rides with 350 people. Places where people are doing a lot to bring back local food, for instance. I've already talked to people at farmers markets and organic who are going to do, you know, big piles, pyramids of 350 pumpkins and, you know, get all that kind of thing. Now, all of that's very good and very important. It is worth saying that one of the problems that we face is, given the scale of the change that we need and the short time in which we have to make it, there's no getting around the fact, I think, that we're going to need some legislation, too, to make that happen. I mean, the key thing is changing the price of carbon so that we get change on a massive enough scale to count. And one of the things that become clear to me over the years, I mean, look, I completely believe in all the sort of individual action that everybody needs to take. I mean, I have a prize for having the most energy efficient house in my state, you know, and I drove the first hybrid car in the state, and now now except for the fact that I'm jetting around the world talking about carbon, I try not to drive much at all, you know, and so on and so forth. But you can't make the math work one light bulb at a time, you know. We can't, the 5% of people or whatever that we might be able to rally to this aren't, by changing their own lives, enough of a numerical factor to dramatically shift the atmospheric concentration of CO2. But 5% of people, if we could mobilize that, are more than enough to shift the political dynamic in this country and pass legislation in this country and in this world that could. So it's some interesting combination of all of those. And frankly, I mean, the message that I should be trying to get out across to everybody is, on that day and around it and whatever, people should be thinking, I mean, this is the least, we're not an organization, and all we're really doing is having like a potluck supper, okay? We're just telling everybody, here's the date and here's the theme, October 24th, 350, okay? And you all figure out what makes sense where you are, what political, you know, because it's different in different places. I mean, it's wickedly different organizing in China, you know, than it is in the U.S., and it's different in India, and it's very different if you're in poor countries and in rich countries, and in figuring out how it all works. But that's the one good thing about that number. It serves as a uniting common principle, or so we hope.
I think this campaign is totally awesome, and I want to see MIT do some really cool hacks around 350. And I think the focus on legislators and policy is dead on. But I wouldn't let you leave MIT without making some arcane scientific technical point, which is that you're saying 350 parts per million of CO2.
Yes.
Is that are methane and nitrous oxide and
yes.
and CFCs things that we need to be thinking
yes,
about, or
we
not,
do.
And how?
We do. And in fact, Meg and I were just having this conversation a little while ago. For simplicity's sake, in a sense, and because CO2 is the most important gas, and because it's the one that's going to be hardest to deal with politically, okay, it's the one that Hansen and his team concentrated on and that we're concentrating on. However, we've now also talked about there's people organizing around 350 CO2 equivalent, all right, which tries to include all those other gases. Now, it's hard to do, in part because those gases, other gases, wash both ways, right? We've got a lot of aerosols in the atmosphere right now that are masking global warming, and and others, nitrous oxide and methane and things that are contributing to them and whatever. So the important thing to realize about the target is that it's a little less hard than it sounds, I mean, you're sophisticated, you all are scientifically sophisticated, so I don't have to tell you what I sometimes do. It's not like if we're at 351, we're doomed, and we're at 349, we're saved, okay? The real point of it is to say the change that we need is not gradual and transformative and in the future. It's that we need to turn the freaking thing, or the ship around now, okay? We need to jam on the brakes and toss it into reverse as fast as we can. And exactly where we end up or how quickly we get there, whatever, is essentially impossible to predict. But 350 is the best target we have at the moment. And Hansen's advice, and if you read the original Target CO2 paper, he talks about how CO2 serves as a useful proxy for all the other gases, and that's sort of the thing to concentrate on. But it's a good question.
Do you want to try the video again? The sound appears to be working.
Yes, would people like to? Be much better than listening to me talk. So let's see 90 seconds of. science video. The other thing, so that was without any words at all, and the website, just those of you who are interested in web things, the website now is translated into, we've got sort of volunteer corps of translators keeping it going more or less in about 12 languages, which is very unusual and very hard. Takes a lot of people's work and effort to make it happen, but it's very worth it when you suddenly are finding, when the email comes up and, something the other day, yesterday, I got an email from these people in a city in Nigeria that I'd never even heard of, Abakaliki. It turns out to be like the third biggest city or something in Nigeria. They're listed a dozen things they're going to do on October 24th. All these huge plans. They complete, and they weren't reading it in English. They were, it's quite interesting to see it start to happen.
Thanks, Bill. I've got a couple of ideas and one question. And first I want to point out something else that you did that I thought was really effective, and that was the Capitol Climate Action in D.C. on March 2nd. And one of the things that I think was really important was the tactic itself, and it was a call for people to come and join in civil disobedience at the power plant that powers the coal plant that powers Congress. And the success of the tactic, I think, is something that's really important to keep in mind. And I think Congress responded because of the threat of that tactic. Yep. There were literally thousands of people who came to D.C. contemplating civil disobedience, and a lot of us joined in and blocked the gates of this coal plant, and you got the response.
And this was at the end of this incredibly inspiring weekend of power shift with thousands of young people from across America. It was, the whole thing rocked. And so Wendell Berry and I, the Kentucky farmer, had written this letter saying, come, let's shut down this coal-fired power plant in D.C. And lots of people here came along to help, and it was incredible. And there were so many people that they couldn't arrest any of us. The police said, well, we don't have space for 5,000 people, and how would we choose? And so, but it didn't make any difference because Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid had written a letter the day before saying, okay, we'll switch it off coal. After 103 years, we'll put it on natural gas, beginning next year. So, yeah, it was actually, in a business where there are very few clear-cut victories, it was fun, I must say. I'm sorry.
So one of the things, I'm part of an organization that, responding to your letter with Wendell Berry and that call for action, we piggybacked on it, and we tried to find. We work with some organizations who locally they're fighting coal plants because of mostly the health impact, and we tried. We reached out to people that we were working with on that stuff, and we just kind of put out a call saying how many. There are 6 coal plants in Massachusetts. How many local demonstrations, solidarity demonstrations could we do? and we ended up having 3 local actions on March 1st, and it just kind of snowballed into we were able to get a grant to get a van to go down to DC and join you the next day, and it was definitely the idea of piggybacking on top of this thing. So people should be thinking about, putting a little bit of work into October 24th and what that can do on top of the stuff that's already buzzing around. And I guess this isn't my question, but I wonder if you happen to know how many towns and cities there are in Massachusetts.
There are 350 towns in Massachusetts?
There are 351.
Whoa.
And I'm
We'll have
trying
to decide who can't participate.
I'm trying to get my organization to put out a challenge of getting at least 350 of these towns and cities to have something on October 24th.
See, that is, and here's the thing, okay? There are so many people around this world doing great stuff in their local place, right? Stuff that has to happen. Paul Hawken wrote a great book called Blessed Unrest a couple of years ago that listed, the appendix was just tens of thousands, and his database is millions of organizations, watershed organizations, people working on food security in the smallest parts of Africa or South America or whatever, just all over the world. And that work is incredibly important. And all of it is going to be completely for naught if we're not able to bring climate change under control, okay? Huge changes in climate are the one thing that can undo all the other things that people are... So for one day, we need a way for all those people doing all those kind of things, all of you working, to also be able to be powerful in a kind of global sense on this most global of issues. Because it's part and parcel of all that other work. So I hadn't really thought about it in those terms until you said that, and that's absolutely right.
And my question is, among the clear-headed people out there who are grappling with the implications of 350 and all this means and looking at Copenhagen, is there a growing consensus or idea of the kinds of ask that we're making?
I mean, like what
are
we
we
have
asking,
to do to meet?
What we're asking the U.S. position to be, what we're asking for the treaty itself to be, that kind of thing?
Some. And we're not playing a huge role in that because we're so completely focused on this sort of public witness and moving the... We need to move the political mood enough that there's room for them, people who are negotiating, to really be able to go much further than they can go now, in the same way that we have to give Obama, who wants to do the right thing, a lot of political space, a lot of, build a movement to let him, as Franklin Roosevelt once said, when some group came and told him that he needed to be doing this, that, and the other thing, and he said, yes, I agree with you completely, now go out there and make me do it. I mean, that's precisely where we are with the president now. He needs our help. So the exact shape of how it's all going to look and what the future will look like if we do this and stuff is in many ways very unpredictable. The change that we're talking about is so enormous. Clearly, it involves changes in the price of fossil fuel, okay, driving a lot of behavior. What we need, the sine qua non for anything that's going to work, is an effective and stiff cap on carbon. Right? The trading part, all of the rest is secondary. It's the cap that matters. Once we do that, once we get an effective cap, I'm reasonably, the thing we have to hope for, one of the things we have to hope for is that market forces work as powerfully as people keep insisting that they do. That the kind of wave of innovation and entrepreneurship that places like MIT are absolutely full of, allows that change to happen with great rapidity. That if we get the base conditions right, the reaction will be very large and quick and swift, okay? We'll see. I mean, it's not the greatest year to be counting on capitalism to accomplish, great wonders. But at a certain level, we don't have too much choice, I think, in this regard, given the change we need in the time we have. But I think the one thing that one can safely say about the architecture of the world that follows is that it won't be dominated by any particular one technology. We already had our magic fuel, fossil fuel was it. Great stuff, easy to transport, easy to get at, rich in BTUs. What comes afterwards is different. It's more diffuse. It's more spread out. It probably leads, hopefully, to more decentralized economies and polities and everything else. We'll see. But very different in that way. But frankly, I got to say, I'm almost the wrong person to ask. For the next 7 months, I find myself unable to think beyond sort of October 24th and how do we open up as much political space as possible so that the people who are going to be doing that, negotiating and whatever, have something to work with, you know.
Hi, Bill. I actually have a comment that goes to that. My name is Craig Altimos. I'm a grad student over at Harvard. I'm the co-coordinator of Massachusetts Power Shift, which is a statewide network of student activists who are organized around this stuff. We're going to be putting on a 350 event with a number of other organizations who are present here today, but we're actually probably going to be doing it as part of our campaign, which is to repower America with 100% clean electricity in 10 years, which is Gore's goal.
Gore's goal.
We actually just got on April 7th, on Tuesday, we actually got the Massachusetts State Legislature, the second house, we got the Senate to pass it earlier, but to pass a resolution calling on the federal government to do just that.
Great.
And so we're probably going to be...
Very cool.
So we actually have a series of town hall meetings around the state this Saturday, including one in Harvard Square at the Unitarian Universalist Church, which I invite all you guys to come out to and take part in. Again, we're going to be trying to move us towards this 350 number by using that as a political ask to increase the urgency. But immediately I do have another ask, is that right after this event I'm going to be grabbing a beer with my friend Adam Siegel, the co-president of Sustainability at MIT. So I'd invite especially the students in the audience who might want to find out about how you can get more involved in the stuff we're doing to join us afterwards. Thank you very much.
Now, see, this is the sad story of my life, which is all I want to do is go drink beer with MIT. And I have a 7 o'clock flight to get to the next place where I have to you know, just continue my, you know, spiel. But I feel like I'm leaving things in very good hands at MIT and in Massachusetts in general. In fact, I would go so far to say that there's no place in the country that's picked up more on this message than Massachusetts and really the Northeast in general, because it's where maybe because it's where we've sort of started this most in Vermont some years ago, but it's now spreading out very fast. And just keep in mind that one of the things that you guys need to do beyond organizing here close to home is figure out how to push this message out into the world. And everybody's capable of doing that now. Is if you have a computer and an internet connection, you have a global reach that, you know, nobody, I mean literally nobody, the most connected person in the world 20 years ago, or 25 years ago, didn't have anywhere near the number of connections that, you know, my mother sitting in her retirement community with her Mac has now, you know. She can reach, and she does, believe me, I mean, I've got her hard at work, you know. And this is just what we need y'all figuring out how to do too. That'd be good. So I think I've got time for 2 more questions here. So one here and one here.
All right. Mr. McKibben, thank you for coming. I'm a graduate student at MIT here, and you've done some great stuff, and I appreciate it.
Thank you.
I guess I'm here. I'm also here as a small business owner of a clean energy solar company, and we put solar on. But here's, as a grad student, as a technical guy, I'm here because I believe that humans are causing global warming. The key note there is that I believe in it, and what I think is actually completely lacking in this discussion, and it may not be the time to do this, is the technical basis behind why humans are causing. This is what I run into when I speak to my very intelligent colleagues, is they say, yeah, you know, you have really good reports which say we're the cause of this, but at the same time there's other very well written, whether the technical basis, because I'm not a climatologist, I haven't devoted my life to studying climatology, and I can't. I have other things to worry about, so I have to rely on the scientists and the climatologists, and I have to make a belief and put my faith in something. And so my question is, how do you respond to these people that say, listen, I don't know what to believe?
Well, it's a good question. And it's certainly one I've spent a lot of time over the years dealing with, right? And we actually thought 2 or 3 years ago that the question was sort of going away. But in fact, as we've gotten closer to taking real action and the stakes have gotten higher, Exxon et al. Have poured even more money into the sort of disinformation industry, and it's sort of back. Most Americans believe that climate change is coming and that it's caused by human beings. Okay, the polling data is pretty good. But there's a vociferous minority that doesn't. They're very hard to convert because most of their belief is not scientific, it's ideological. That is, there's a syllogism in their heads that goes, I believe markets solve all problems. Markets aren't solving global warming, therefore global warming isn't a problem. Okay? Not a very logical syllogism, but a very emotionally comforting one if you've spent the last 20 years in the sweaty embrace of Rush Limbaugh or something. Okay? There's really no way to break through it except to keep reminding people that environmentalists actually, in this case, want markets to go to work. We just need to feed them some information to work with. And that actually turns out to be a fairly effective argument sometimes with people on that side. Otherwise, the argument tends to break down very generationally. And the polling data is very clear on that. That, above a certain age, there's much higher resistance to coming to terms with this problem, I'm less worried about convincing the last 30% of people than I am about getting some significant percentage of the other 70% to understand that it's a problem to do something about it, okay? I'm fine with preaching to the choir. I just need the choir to sing a lot louder than they're singing at the moment, okay? And if we do, then there's more than enough people to make what needs to happen happen. Not easily. None of this ever comes easily, but that's why we do the kind of thing we do. But it's a very good point.
And real quick, as a technical person for my MIT colleagues, et cetera, where would you recommend to get the best, most succinct information?
Realclimate.org.
Was that?
Realclimate.org.
Okay.
By scientists for scientists.
All right, great. Thank you.
Good fun.
Neil Rawhauser, I'm with the. Can you hear me?
Yes.
With the Stranded Wind Initiative.
Yes.
I have a fairly good electronic reach if I choose to write about climate issues.
Yes.
And I've recently wandered into my local newspaper office and volunteered myself as a columnist. So I have now a weekly energy column. And I crept across the border from Redneckistan to get here. And I'm going back to a district that gave over 60% of its votes to John McCain
yes.
in the most recent election. The previous questioner covered a lot of my concerns with
yes.
your answer. But there's very much a religious bent to the focus on the, how do I put it, the climate change doubters. Do you have any particular recommendations for how to handle that group?
Yes. If people who are religious, there's been a big shift in the last few years, and more and more we're finding support and useful support, especially from evangelical Christians. Again, it's very generational, okay? But most of the leaders of the evangelical movement, including the heads of all the seminaries and colleges and things, signed on to a powerful statement, the Evangelical Declaration on Climate, about a year and a half ago, that's been very useful. And the same sort of thing, I mean, that's one of the big areas where we're trying to organize. And with some luck, I was at Oklahoma Christian University a few weeks ago. Now, however red your district, I guarantee you that the Oklahoma Christian is sort of the reddest place in the reddest state in America, okay? But the kids there were completely down with this. And that evening, they sort of commandeered the chapel and rang the bell 350 times, okay, after the talk, Very big story in the paper the next day. Very powerful, very beautiful, starting to happen. They come from a completely different world than people at MIT, okay? You guys can figure out what the equivalent sort of things here are going to be. And I have no doubt that they'll be incredibly interesting, and there are very few images I'll look forward more to seeing on October 24th than the ones coming from here. Thank you all enormously.